Chapter 12, The Council of War. A sudden snap could be heard. The two ends of the handcuffs hit Richard each like the crack of the whip. The boy bit into the gag with force. He was in such pain. But he now had free hands. He massaged his sore wrists a bit, then hurried to undo the plastic cord that was restraining his feet, and removed the dirty cloth that was making it difficult for him to breathe. He opened his mouth, finally filling his lungs with air. He did it. He had succeeded in removing his handcuffs, and could now leave and finally look for a bathroom. He had proved himself smarter than a secret agent. As the thought crossed his mind, he turned his head. His gaze fixed on one of the men in black, who was moaning and slowly writhing, tied up with his head covered. He couldn't leave him like that. Even though he was dying to get out of the small room as quickly as possible, he needed to help him. He sighed, approached the man and removed the cover from his head. It was Weasel. Richard had been hoping that it would be Lone Wolf, the leader, who seemed to be the most professional of the three. But at least it wasn't Ferret with his lisp that drove him crazy. "I'll free you right away," the young man whispered to him. "Just give me a moment." In several minutes, the agent was free and breathing with difficulty. "How did you manage to get free?" he asked. Richard pointed out the small nail sticking out from the wall several centimeters from the ground. It was incredible to think that such a tiny piece of metal could be so useful. Weasel shook his head. "If my head hadn't been covered, I would have seen it right away. But these criminals know their job well and understand where to look out for danger." Okay. Richard interrupted, beginning to get impatient. "What are we going to do now?" "We need to get in contact with Dido. Lone Wolf has a transmitter implanted in one of his teeth, but if he's gagged, he can't use it." "Okay, then, let's go find him," proposed Richard almost at the same time as thinking, "and I hope we'll come across a bathroom along the way." Eva Skinner was beginning to feel bored. They had been shut in this dark tower for a very long time now. XANA and Alita had disappeared, and she really wanted to take a walk. Fortunately, she had met Odd. Eva's memories about him were somewhat confusing though. From time to time, things would pop back up in her head of what she had done or said while under the control of XANA, but the images seemed distant to her, as if they belonged to the mind of someone else. For XANA, Odd simply seemed to be an idiot. Eva, however, found him nice. He always had a joke to tell, and he was trying to entertain her as best as he could. And his catboy getup was pretty interesting. In any case, it was better than his friend, Ulrich's, Japanese clothes. Furthermore, Odd seemed to be a real expert in music. He knew the subdigitals and owned all their soundtracks. They at least had something in common. But she was so bored. Odd stood suddenly, jumped on the wall, ran several meters towards the ceiling, let himself hang from the smooth surface with the claws from his hands and his feet, performed an elegant pirouette and landed in front of Eva with a bow. Surprised, the young girl applauded. "Stop clowning around, Odd." Ulrich reprimanded him, who had been until then off to the side, talking with Yumi. Odd stuck his tongue out at him. "I'm getting bored. I mean, we're here, stuck in a tower on Lyoko, while who knows what is happening in the real world." "It's true," said Yumi. "I'm really worried about my parents and all the others. Let's hope that nothing happens to them." Eva shrugged. These French kids were really weird. "And what is it you all want to do?" she asked. "You won't stop talking about this green phoenix, but they're adults, and they have weapons. How do you plan on beating them? With a pair of wooden geisha sandals?" Yumi stood, her cheeks reddened in anger. "I have weapons," she exclaimed. Angrily, the young girl grabbed the fans from her kimono sash, opened them and threw them. They looked like a pair of boomerangs headed towards Eva at full speed. The young girl moved instinctively. She covered her face with her hands to protect herself, and gave out a sharp cry. "UAAH!" She opened her eyes wide in surprise. Eva had always had good lungs, but her voice was exceptional this time. Before her mouth, The air had taken the form of musical notes in different colors that flew into Yumi like a blast of projectiles. The young girl in Japanese clothing recovered her fans from the air, as they returned to her like boomerangs and used them like a shield against the notes, which were deflected and stuck into the wall around the tower. They must have been really sharp. We finally discovered Eva's power, commented Odd with a teasing smile. Yeah, observed Ulrich. Too bad that we can't have our Lyoko powers in the real world. Otherwise, we could really show these terrorists a thing or two. Bringing Lyoko powers to the real world, spoke XANA, pensively. Eva looked towards the ceiling. He and Alita were floating towards them, descending through the air as if they were being held up by thousands of small, invisible cables. The young blonde smiled. You know what? Maybe we could do just that. Everybody looked on in surprise. The door to the storeroom was locked. Weasel wouldn't let himself be discouraged by this fact though, and stuck the rusty nail into the side of the door to pick the lock. Then he gave Richard a wink. See, he said. I'm a real professional. Maybe so, admitted the young man. But what do you think we should do now? There could be guards on the other side. That won't be a problem. I'm also an expert in martial arts. Richard hoped with all his heart for this to be true. Shaking, he reached out his hand and opened the door wide. He found himself facing a hallway. Through a small window at the end, the afternoon sun's light shone through. A lot of time had passed since they'd been captured. Almost an entire day, in fact. But there were no soldiers in sight. Richard and Weasel left the small room. Throughout the length of the hall were other doors, all metal and identical to one another, like the one they had just exited. They turned a doorknob. An empty room. Trying not to make any noise, they tried again with the second door, which opened with a creak. Inside the room were two soldiers watching a small television. Alarmed by the noise, the two men sprung to their feet. Weasel threw himself at the closest one, launching into a wild attack of rapid karate strikes. The other man observed Richard, analyzing him for a moment, then grabbed a large gun from his belt. The young man began to back up, but tripped on one of the uneven slabs of floor and fell forward, hitting the soldier in the gut with his head. The man grunted and kicked Richard in the stomach, immediately knocking the wind out of him. He rolled on the floor. The soldier was already on top of him, ready to give him another kick, but to the face, when the young man heard Weasel's commanding voice. Hands in the air, my friend. Richard turned to see that the man in black had knocked out his opponent and had taken possession of his submachine gun. Weasel gestured towards Richard to get up, then forced the soldier to kneel by his unconscious partner. Good, he exclaimed. Richard, help me tie them up. Ulrich took out his katana from its sheath and played with it, tossing it from one hand to another, making it spin in the air. On Lyoko, his sword was so sharp that it could cut through anything. It could cut a manta ray in half, and even cut rocks into pieces with one slice. Having it with him in the real world would be fantastic. But the young boy doubted that it would be possible. The thing is located in the first city, XANA explained. The castle allows me to give life to anything I want and materialize it in the real world. For example, I could create an entire army of robots. I knew it was you, observed Odd. You put us in one heck of a position by attacking Katic. XANA lowered his eyes and held his gaze at the ground. I'm really sorry, but at the time, my priorities were a bit different. In any case, like I said before, thanks to the castle, I can create an army, then use the towers to send it to the real world. And that will make the creatures appear in the scanners at the factory, Ulrich completed. Well, yes, precisely. The samurai boy raised his arms up high with enthusiasm. But, that's great. Then, we really can win against all the tough soldiers of the Green Phoenix. All 5 of you will, XANA said immediately afterwards. I'll be staying here to control my creatures from a distance. But we have another problem. Yumi, who up until now had remained silent, nodded with a taciturn look about her face. Mago could shut down the supercomputer at any moment, she said. Exactly, Alita confirmed. That's why we need to speak to Jeremy. We need to find a way to prevent Mago from using the command post until we've finished our attack. But how can we contact him? XANA smiled. At the moment, your friend is connected to the mirror. Opening another portal to that virtual world would be too complicated. But I can try to communicate with him. And Jeremy will find a way to get us out of here, approved. Perfect. Let's call him right away. It's time we have a council of war. Thanks to his virtual reality glasses, Jeremy could observe the mirror from the outside as if it were a film on television. And he was watching a really interesting scene now. It was the 3rd of June, 1994, and Professor Hopper was in the attic of the Hermitage. He seemed nervous, pacing forward and back while mumbling to himself something about the code down. I need space on my disk to register the backup. Too much space, darn it. Where am I going to find such a powerful memory system? It would need to be able to conserve my data for a very long time. Several minutes later, Alita entered the room. Jeremy's heart sank upon seeing her. What he was seeing in front of his eyes was a recording from 10 years ago, but Alita was still exactly identical. At that moment, Jeremy decided that he needed to find a way to describe her to her mother. Anthea hadn't yet recovered all her memories, but the boy had noticed a strange happiness about her. And the tears. Can I help you with anything? Alita said to her father in the mirror. Perhaps you can, the professor replied. But I don't know if it's a good idea. I mean, I don't know what kind of effect it will have on you. These words activated something in Jeremy's head, and his brain began to work at full speed, like a finger following a complex treasure map. The code down. Hopper, who needed an unbelievable amount of space to save a backup copy, and didn't know what effect that would have on Alita. The incomprehensible codes of Richard's Palm computer. An activation program, then something else. Jeremy smiled. Professor Hopper was a genius. Several moments later, before Jeremy's surprised eyes, appeared the face of a boy with blonde hair. XANA winked at him. I've detected that you can't speak to me, he said. But as long as you can hear me, that'll be enough. Your friends and I have decided that. Jeremy listened carefully to XANA's idea. It could work well. All that was necessary was to work out a time and act all at once. They really had a chance at taking down the Green Phoenix. And so, Jeremy left his hunch to the side in a corner of his memory for now. Chapter 13, The Decisive Night. Kurtz and Lone Wolf had been placed in separate rooms from the others. The man in black and the ex-army major had been hooded, while the children's parents had only been tied up and gagged, just like Richard. He and Weasel had freed them as quickly as possible, and they had then all regrouped in Lone Wolf's cell, which was the largest and had a small, barred window. It was too short and narrow for them to break open and escape, but it was enough to let a small amount of the gloomy night air in. The whole group was tired and drained of strength. Michael Belpois had a black iron ferret, who couldn't move his right arm, wore the submachine gun over his shoulder. But they were free once more, they had a weapon, and they could finally make their move. Richard saw Lone Wolf stick one of his hands into his mouth. The man poked and prodded around a bit until he managed to pull out a tooth. It was a large molar that seemed authentic, but the man in black unscrewed one side, revealing a minuscule button which he then pressed with a thumb. "Is that it?" asked Walter Stern with a critical look. Lone Wolf gave a small, knowing smile. "This is actually a marvelous, very advanced piece of technology that I had implanted not long before I parachuted down to Kadik. This false tooth contains a very powerful Morse code transmitter. It can function almost anywhere, from the furthest deserts to the cement bunkers built below the ground. With it, I can get in contact with Dido. Of course, it's reserved for situations of the utmost urgency." "So, get to work," commented Hertz dryly. "The situation could become critical at any moment." Lone Wolf began to press the button at regular intervals, short long short short long. What should I transmit? He asked. Communicate to Dido that we're free, said Professor Hertz. And that we intend to attack the terrorists. It's almost 9 o'clock and I imagine that Dido will need about 2 hours to prepare. So tell her that we're going to act at midnight. And that we're going to need reinforcements. Lone Wolf nodded and continued to press the button on the minuscule object. During this time, Richard turned to the professor. He was mortified. Freeing all of them had been the most heroic action in his life. But he didn't feel ready to confront the soldiers in direct combat. He was nothing more than a meager, freckled engineering student, while the heroes on TV were all tall and big like closets, with enormous, muscly arms. It's to be a while before midnight comes, he observed. What are we going to do in the meantime? To be able to attack the men of the Green Phoenix, we're going to need weapons, Professor Hertz responded resolutely, so we're going to have to find ourselves some. 9 at factory, free and armed. Terrorists 90+ attack 0 hours. Reinforcements. Maybe children. Max caution. The message arrived on Dido's mobile phone along with the low ring that indicated urgent communications. The identification code was Lone Wolf's. He had used the satellite Morse code transmitter. The device alone cost a small fortune. Each letter was sent to a spy satellite network in orbit around the Earth, then was translated from Morse code and sent to Dido wherever she was at the time. This simple message had cost the agency nearly $500 million. But it was money well spent. Dido smiled. She was still in the science laboratory at Kadak Academy, and this day had been one of the most tiring of her entire lift. She had spoken for hours and hours with important representatives of the French government, higher-ups in the army, and Maggie, who was situated at their center of operations in Brussels. Dido had given explanations, protested, fought, disputed, elaborated, and rejected action plans. She hadn't even had the time to eat anything. She was limited to drinking enormous cups of steaming, sugary coffee constantly to be able to stay awake. The boss of the men in black began to hammer her computer keyboard impetuously until Maggie's face appeared on her screen. Her secretary seemed calm and reposed, as if she hadn't flown there from Washington less than 24 hours earlier to resolve a problem that threatened to destroy the world. "Madam," she said. Dido activated all the anti-listening devices she had installed on the computer when she arrived and signaled for Maggie to do the same. For an instant, the woman felt her hands tremble. As highly sophisticated as her programs were, from within Lyoko, Hannibal Mago could decrypt them effortlessly. If the boss of the Green Phoenix had already obtained full control over the supercomputer, Dido's task was doomed to failure. "There will be an attack on the factory," she explained to her assistant. "I'll send you the time on your mobile phone, just in case." "Of course, madam. I want you to immediately organize a combat-ready team of men. It's a level Delta Red mission. Maximum priority." "Of course, madam." Dido sighed. Now came the more difficult part. "The Black Raven mission is not postponed," she murmured, "but it needs to be ready to intervene at X hour and 30 minutes, if the infantry's attack fails." On the screen, Maggie's face didn't even flinch. Dido cut the connection. Black Raven was the name of the Men in Black's fighter bomber, which carried a large load of bombs and missiles under its wings that were capable of pulverizing the entire island on which the old factory sat. The maximum she had managed to obtain, after all the hours of negotiation with the higher-ups in the French government and army, was that the destruction of the supercomputer would not be carried out before midnight. In other words, there was a very small time frame in which to have her men carry out the attack on the factory, neutralize the terrorists, and contact the pilot to abort the attack. Tonight, everyone's lives would be hanging by a thread. The children had transformed the Lyoko Tower into a training camp. XANA had created some manta rays that were whizzing about in the air, firing dazzling blue lasers. Ulrich attacked the monsters with his katana. Odd ran on the walls and shot at the manta rays using his laser arrows, which fired out of his gloves. Yumi threw her fans, sharp as daggers. Alita and Eva, however, were practicing some distance from the others. Alita stopped for a moment and asked Eva to suspend their exercises. All the shouting and screaming was hurting her ears, and she also wanted to talk to XANA. The boy was seated cross-legged on the tower floor, and kept his eyes riveted towards the ceiling, as if he was concentrating on a very difficult problem. Alita approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Is everything all right?" she asked him, slight worry in her tone of voice. XANA interrupted the sentence he had started, and his eyes met Alita's. For a moment, the girl saw them change color, going from red to dark blue, then purple. "I'm not really human," he exclaimed. "I mean, I feel different than before, I'm feeling emotions, and I know that we're all friends. But I'm still a creature of Lyoko. You see," he gestured to everything around them. "I created the manta rays, I used the towers to connect me to the real world, and I still have lots of powers. I can't enter other people's minds, but I can still change the color of my hair and eyes." Alita smiled. "You don't have a physical body, and that's what lets you use your powers. But it's not a body that makes a person human, but how they think and behave. That's why I don't care if you can intercept telephone calls anywhere in the world, or create manta rays or other things like that. To me, you're as human as I am, or Jeremy, or Ulrich, or..." The young man sighed. "Speaking of intercepting calls, I think I've just discovered something important." XANA stood up and pointed his hands towards the ceiling. The manta rays disappeared into small puffs of smoke. Odd, who had managed to get on the back of one of them, and was hanging onto the horns on its mouth like a cowboy at a rodeo, fell to the floor, where he landed in a somersault. XANA drew a square in the air, and inside it appeared digital numbers. 2 hours 30 minutes and 59 seconds. An instant later the 59 became a 58, then 57. It was a countdown. Alita looked at the boy, slightly perplexed, and he began to explain. "For the last half hour, I've managed to listen in on some very interesting communications. The first came from the factory, a satellite transmission in very advanced Morse code. It said that the others have managed to free themselves and get some weapons. They intend to attack the terrorists at midnight and have solicited Dido's help." "Wow," exclaimed Odd, impressed. "Yeah," Ulrich immediately added. "Now I understand why everyone's so interested in Lyoko and the supercomputer. If it's used in the right way, its power to control everything really gets everyone on edge." XANA nodded. "And that's not all," he added. "What's more, I listened to Dido's response. The men in black are ready to attack the factory, also at midnight, in order to accompany the attack from inside with one from outside." "And we'll be there too," commented Yumi with a smile. "We can coordinate our assault with theirs, materialize ourselves with our powers and deliver the coup de grace to the Green Phoenix." "Yes, but there's also something else," XANA exclaimed. "Dido spoke of an operation called Black Raven. It's her plan B, in case the attack on the factory fails. But I couldn't find even a hint of any information on Black Raven. They must have organized the mission using non-electronic communications, or something like that." "Black Raven doesn't sound very friendly," Odd mumbled. "It could be what Jeremy was telling us about before. The men in black are equipped to destroy the factory to get rid of the terrorists once and for all. We'll need to keep our eyes wide open and..." Alita approached XANA and winked at him. "Let's do this one step at a time," she said. "Our current priority is to warn Jeremy about when the attack will be. He'll need to find a way to get Hannibal Mago's remote control before midnight tonight." Jeremy had never been in the factory's machinery room. It was a gigantic room, so long it was hard to see where it ended. There were enormous machines all over the place, turned off and covered in dust, rusty metal turbines, pipes, valves, cranks, compressors and immense electrical quadrants with all the interrupters lowered. The Green Phoenix soldiers had transformed this place into a cafeteria, lining up lots of small tables of different shape and color along the central corridor of the room. About 70 of them were now seated with their rifles and submachine guns resting on their tables. They silently ate disgusting-looking bowls of soup of undefinable color, and their eyes were glued to portable televisions placed at regular intervals throughout the room. Jeremy entered accompanied by Memory and Gregory Netapolis, who hadn't let them out of his sight since midday. They found empty seats and sat. Gregory raised his hand and grunted at a soldier wearing a ridiculous apron that had at a time in the past been white, hurried to bring them 3 bowls. Although the soup didn't look appealing, its taste would undoubtedly be even worse. To Jeremy it seemed to be a mixture of canned meat, spinach and dirty socks. But he forced it down. He would need his strength to remain on the ball and help his friends. To avoid thinking about the horrible soup, the child began to watch the television. It was the evening news broadcast. On the lowest part of the screen headlines from different stories scrolled past, and on the right the time was superimposed over the top, showing that it was shortly after 10 o'clock. The information was the same as always: a war in a far-off country, politicians battling over incomprehensible agendas, and the results of soccer matches. Not a single reference to the terrorists, the men in black, or the old factory. Jeremy smiled. Dido was a true professional. She had managed to keep this whole affair under wraps. Suddenly, all the televisions changed channel without anyone having touched the controls. The screens remained dark for an instant, then all began to show an old black and white film with 2 samurais fighting on the edge of a cliff, attacking and defending furiously with their katanas. After several seconds, the images changed again to show a cartoon with a cat walking on its hind legs, trying to trap its mortal enemy, a mouse that was much more cunning than he. A few soldiers started to grouse. One of them stood up to whack the television, but the screen beat him to it and returned to the news. Jeremy's eyes flew to the time on the lower right, which now said midnight. It only lasted an instant before it returned to the correct reading, 22:16. The boy began to think. The black screen, the men in black. The samurai and the cat, like Ulrich and Odd. And the time, midnight. XANA was capable of telling when Jeremy was in front of his computer, and so he should also be able to tell when he was watching TV. Maybe these strange clips were a coded message for him. Jeremy's head hurt. Maybe he was going crazy. But no, it couldn't be a coincidence. It was clearly a message. Midnight, the time of the combined attack by his friends and the men in black. The boy inhaled his horrible soup in a single gulp and stood. "We'd best get back to work," he said to Memory. "We still have a lot of work to do before we finish Mago's bot. And I've just had an idea." Throughout his criminal career, Gregory Netapolis had learned never to trust anything or anyone. Especially what seemed to be a simple coincidence. The man had immediately noticed the time on the news report changing, but what had made him even more suspicious was Jeremy's behavior. Before dinner, the agent had gone to see Hannibal and Scipio, who had been chained up in front of the factory's tall front door, to bring them 2 bones. They had seemed nervous, their ears rigid, and their noses sniffing away at the cold night air. His dog's instincts were rarely wrong. They sensed that the situation was nearing fever pitch. Gregory knew that with each hour that passed, Mago's game became more and more dangerous. The leader of the Green Phoenix knew to keep the French government in check, and he had no doubt that the army was preparing a counterattack. There would be a battle, and soon. And there would be no guarantee that Mago would win. Gregory smiled. As usual, he managed on his own in one way or another. He had a natural instinct for abandoning ship the second it began to sink. For now, he needed to continue to keep an eye on the boy. Although he was only 13, he seemed much more cunning than most adults. The man stood and grabbed Jeremy's shoulder. He gripped extra hard to make sure he heard him. "Let's go," he exhorted. "I'll accompany you."
It really seems like all the pieces are finally starting to fall into place. The warrior gearing up, Dido's army at the ready, Jeremy biding his time. The bait attack might come soon, and yet I am so super nervous. And yet, hold on, if monsters can't access the towers, how does XANA materialize mantas for training? I guess if XANA can't do everything he wants on Lyoko, so it gives the monsters access. I guess he can. Also, I saw what you did there, like describing Tom and Jerry there. And again, I'm getting excited. Enjoy the second episode for this week, and I'm planning on bursting through this if I can. So I hope to see you all in the next video. See ya!